Hey guys, today I'm super excited to review two amazing bikes. We've got the Specialized Turbo Levo Carbon Expert and the Luna Carbon X1. So I've been lucky enough to have my hands on both of these bikes now for quite a while and put a lot of miles on both bikes. And actually, with those miles, I had this head-to-head in mind, which helped me kind of get impressions for both bikes and how they compare to each other. Of course, you've got a huge OEM with like Specialized with their Turbo Levo offering, and now Luna with their Carbon X1. And first I'm going to talk about the similarities, because these bikes are probably a lot more similar than you might think. So both these bikes have a carbon fiber frame. Now the Specialized, the main body frame is carbon fiber, whereas the Luna-Cycle X1, the entire frame and rear triangle is carbon fiber. The Levo has an alloy rear triangle. Both bikes have a mid-drive system with torque sensor. Both bikes have a 700 watt-hour battery pack. Both bikes have a very similar RockShox front fork. Both bikes have RockShox rear suspension. Both bikes have dropper seat posts. I mean, the list goes on. It's actually crazy just how similar these bikes are. The biggest difference comes in the details, the riding experience, and of course, the price tag. Now, despite the similarities of these two bikes, there are of course quite a few differences as well, and probably the biggest difference is the sheer power these bikes put out. The X1 has the Bafang M600 that's tuned with Ludicrous by Luna, puts out over 2,000 watts. You can really feel the power. It feels great on the trails, whereas the Specialized, it's rated at 250 watts, but actually with the Cycle Analyst, we saw it putting out more than 700 watts at peak. So it's not quite as slow as you might think. It actually keeps up pretty well to the X1 until you get to the big hills, and then the X1 will just fly past it. So the clear edge in the power category goes to the X1.
One more big difference between these two bikes is the fact that the X1 does come with a manual throttle on the left side thumb. This is great for when you don't want to actually pedal at all. You can use the throttle as much as you want, up to full speed. And the great thing is that regardless of the assist level, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, the throttle does work full power in any assist mode. So if you're in level 1 or 2 on a tight trail and you have to quickly hit the throttle to get over something, it does work in that regard, and it's actually great in that use.
So I'm going to take the Levo down this little concrete path here at the bottom of this dam up here at Lake Puddingstone. It's kind of a good little climb, even though it's paved concrete. It's a little challenging getting out of it. So we'll start at the bottom, and I'll use turbo mode on this bike, full power, and go straight up the hill and kind of show what it's like on the Levo when you're on a steep hill here. Gotta lean forward or the front tire does come up. So it's not too difficult, does require some effort. You can't just cruise up it, you gotta put some work in, but it does a good job. So now we'll do the X1. And just for fun, I'm gonna try using throttle only and not even pedaling. So the Levo had to use turbo mode, and, put some work in. I'm gonna try the X1 with just throttle. Let's see if it'll do it. Make sure I've got level 5 selected here, which I do. And here we go. Look at that. Could sip some tea even if I wanted to. So, quite a difference. You can see as the power goes. I mean, I could have climbed something even steeper. It's a matter of just keeping the front tire down, so plenty of power. It's actually great when you want to just fly up stuff. So yeah, X1 kills it on the hills. So I also did a short half-mile hill climb on both bikes, which I sped up for time in this video. I pedaled with similar moderate effort and full power on both bikes. In the short half-mile stretch, the X1 made it to the top 17 seconds faster than the Levo. A pretty clear example of just how much quicker you'll be climbing hills with that much extra power on the X1. One of the most common questions I get asked with any e-bike I've got is, what's the top speed? With the Levo, it's a pretty easy question to answer. It's limited with a governor to 20 miles an hour, so it complies with Class 1 e-bike laws. You can feel at 20 miles an hour, just the power just stops and it kind of keeps you right at 20 unless you want to push past that. You can, it freewheels, you're not limited, mechanically. but you've got no more push behind the motor, and you can definitely feel it. Whereas the X1, there's no limiter on it. It's just limited by power and gearing. Unicycle really kept the gearing in mind for a trail bike. They did not want to make it a top speed road machine. That'd be ridiculous. It's meant to be a full suspension mountain bike. And I'm glad they geared it the way it is. It tops at around 28, 30 miles an hour, which I think is perfect, especially for trail riding, because it still has great low end torque for climbing, and still 30 miles an hour is plenty fast. But in this case, the clear edge for top speed goes to the X1. Now, range is one of those things that really most OEMs hate to quote. They kind of have to. It's really hard to give an answer for range, as all you guys know that ride e-bikes. Everyone asks, what's the range? It is entirely dependent on how much you put into it, what gear you use, how many hills you've climbed. There's so many variables, how much you weigh. The list is endless. But in general, the range, even though the battery packs are the same, the range on the Levo, of course, is better because it does require you to pedal the entire time. Whereas on the X1, it's pretty much impossible to resist the temptation of pushing that thumb throttle when you want to have some fun. And secondly, it is pushing more power when it is powering the bike. So it is consuming more energy. It's just simple physics. So the Levo does have better range. I've personally done over 35 miles with 5,000 feet of climbing on this Levo in one day and still had battery left, which was pretty crazy. It was across Catalina Island. The bike still had juice. I don't suspect if you were on the X1 using throttle and power, you would have made it. Some of the guys on the older Levos with the smaller batteries, they died. They didn't make it the whole way. So it all depends on how much you put into it. But for sure, the Specialized has the edge when it comes to range. Torque sensors. So these bikes both have a torque sensing mid-drive, which means the harder you push on the pedal, the more power the bike gives you. Let's start with the Levo. Really unmatched performance as far as torque sensors and smoothness goes for most e-bikes I've ever ridden. It really feels natural. A small push gives you a bit of power, whereas a hard push, it's a very slow, progressive, linear ramp of power. And you can actually change the settings for that, how aggressive you want that power to come on. If you want a hard hit, if you want a soft hit, you can change all of that on this bike. But out of the box, it feels natural, and anybody can jump on this bike and be comfortable and be safe riding it with no instructions. It just feels that natural. The X1, you know, it's a 2,000 watt bike. It's really hard to make a torque sensor feel natural with that much power, because as you push the pedal, you know, the bike wants to push the power that you're asking for. And if you've got level 5 selected, you want 2,000 watts when you push that pedal, where that rear tire is going to jump, of course, as you do that. So you're balancing the jumping rear tire with you pushing the pedal. It's really hard to make it smooth, and it's evident on the X1 that it's a tough setup to make as linear and smooth as the Levo. So in this case, the clear edge goes to the Levo, but the X1, you know, in the lower power levels feels very good. It does feel smooth, but as soon as you go past level 3, 4, you got to be careful. If you're in a low gear, especially, and you start from a stop and you're in 5, you got to be careful. The bike won't kick you off the back even. So it's really, for beginners, it requires some instruction, and it's entertaining, but definitely not as smooth or natural as the Levo. All right, so trail riding the X1, solid bike. The extra weight kind of makes you feel more confident, especially in the turns. It feels more planted. A lot of that's personal preference. Some guys like the looseness. It's not as nimble, doesn't feel as loose or as tossy as the Levo does. But for those that want a confidence-inspiring ride, especially in the turns, the X1 does a great job with that. Where I think it struggles is, now we're getting these tighter switchbacks here. This is an uphill grade. Pretty decent uphill grade here. If you're in level 1 or 2, it's not a problem. If you're in 3, 4, especially if you're in 5, forget it. When you have to do these tight, slow switchbacks, the throttle sensor sensitivity becomes an issue. Any uphill technical sections, really 1 or 2 is all you can use. If you try to use 3 or higher on your power setting, it's too jerky. The front tire will come up, and it's just very hard to control. Like this right here is like a balancing act. There you go. To not send your front tire up or off into the bush in the corner. I'm in 3 right now, so it's a bit more challenging. Here's a tight one. You got to manage that power really well. See that there? Almost had to get off there. But if I'm in 1 or 2, it's not a problem. I'll go down to 2 right now.
And when it comes down to it, you can actually just use the throttle if you want to not worry about what setting you're in for the tech sections. The throttle is a lot easier to modulate, and the throttle will help you get through those areas without pedal strikes as well.
But aside from that, the bike feels great. All right, so now I'm on the Levo for the trail ride. Overall, it just feels good. It just feels natural, feels normal. If you're used to mountain biking, it's a little more what you're used to. There's not much of a learning curve on the bike. The 29 tires do great in these sections with the big rocks like that. Definitely on some of the ruts and crossings, these larger tires help. But versus the 27.5s, these aren't quite as quick on the turn in. You definitely appreciate the extra clearance they give you though, especially in the e-bike, because the e-bikes tend to have, you know, lower center sections. So overall it feels good. The biggest difference comes into play, of course, when you go to the uphill sections. Even though it's still quick and still fun, and through these flat sections it's great. When you get to the uphill sections, the X1 just takes off, but this just feels more nimble and agile, and really just feels like a normal bike. And that's kind of the best compliment I can pay to it, is it just feels normal. There's not much fanfare or anything too exciting with it, so it's just what you're used to. So when comparing the trail riding ability of both bikes, they're very similar, but also different in subtle ways. The weight of the Levo out of the box was 47 pounds for the carbon Levo, whereas the X1 is 54 pounds. And you can feel that 7-pound difference on the trail. It's not substantial, it's not significant, it doesn't make you say, holy cow, this is way different, but it is noticeable. The Levo does feel more nimble, more agile when you're in the turns, going back and forth real fast. The X1 does feel solid. It feels, because the weight kind of helps it feel more planted, it does feel like you can hit ruts and trees and whatever you want to hit, and you're not going to get bucked off. And surprisingly, it's super stable. But as far as agility goes, I would have to give the edge to the Levo. So the downhill riding actually really surprised me. I was expecting that the X1 would feel very similar to the Levo. I wasn't sure with the rear shock on the X1 not being quite as nice as the one on the Levo in this head-to-head. But man, as nice as the Levo was downhill, and you know, it's not a downhill bike, but it does good enough where you can still scoot and feel comfortable. I jumped on the X1, and me and a buddy both took turns, and we both got to the bottom of the hill. We're just like, man, it was actually substantially better. It was more confidence inspiring. I didn't grab for the brake as much. It just seemed to just plow through stuff going down, and it didn't worry me as much. For some reason on this bike, I'm not sure if it's the 29-inch tires versus the 27.5s on the X1, but I gotta say, the confidence the X1 gave me downhill was much higher than the confidence I had in the Levo. So in the downhill section, the X1 gets a clear edge for me. Now the controls and tuning for the bike, that's where the biggest advantage of the Levo really comes into play. Specialized spent a lot of money developing the tuning app that goes along with the Turbo Levo. Within that app, you can change the power levels of each level of the bike for how much torque you want in that level. You can also adjust the sensitivity of the torque sensor, and you can also adjust how hard it comes on. You can also adjust if it shuttles or not when you're pedaling without actually pushing. You can adjust pretty much everything on this mid-drive, and it's independent and custom for each level. It's really incredible. I've tuned it quite a bit on this bike and got to where I love it now. Unfortunately on the X1 with the new Bafang M600s, it's not a fault so much of Luna, but Bafang has their firmware locked down now where you can't do tuning like you used to on the BBS HDs. Really what you get is what you got. You got 5 levels, 1 through 5, and they're tuned good enough and they're well enough, but some that want to change it, you're kind of out of luck. You can't mess with levels or the torque. It is what it is out of the box, and that's kind of where it lies. Whereas the Levo, again, besides the custom ability to tune levels, it also tracks your ride. It tracks how much torque you put in the bike. It shows how many calories you actually burned based on the torque you actually put into the bike, which is pretty incredible. You can also set a route in the bike. You can say I want to do a 45-mile ride and actually input the map into the application. and it will make sure you retain enough battery to get through that ride. So it monitors your level of exertion, monitors the battery pack, and it makes sure that you can make your 45-mile ride without you running out of juice. And really, that's incredible to me. So huge, clear win in the tunability and controls category for the Levo. So when comparing the components of these bikes side by side, you can see it's pretty clear that the Carbon Levo Expert comes with some pretty awesome components. Both bikes have a very similar front fork, but once you get beyond that, the brakes, the rear shock, the drive system, the seat post, the wheels, the tires, everything on the Levo is a few steps above as far as the cost and quality over the X1. All that stuff's also upgradable, which is kind of nice. So if you're an X1 owner, you get a great deal out of the box and you can choose what you upgrade. And if I was an X1 owner, I would probably just upgrade the rear shock and maybe just the wheels so I could do a tubeless setup, which I love on my bike. Aside from that, you can see that the cost of components alone of the Levo is more than the cost of the entire X1. So you can see where that money goes when you pay as much as you do for this bike. But obviously the components edge goes to the Levo in this case. So one more thing that a lot of people ask me about is, the noise. For some reason, a lot of guys are concerned with noise. Not a big thing to me. It is nice having a quiet bike. Not a huge deal if it's a bit noisier. My initial prototype that Luna gave me to test on the X1 was the original gear. It was not the new silent gear upgrade. Eric since had me bring it back and install the new silent gear. And I've got to say, it is a significant difference with the silent gear, and I highly recommend everyone buying this bike gets the silent gear option if it matters to you that you want the bike quiet. It is a significant reduction in noise. Whereas before, it was clear that the X1 was way louder than the Levo when riding it. You could hear it in the videos. You could just hear it riding past. Now, the X1 is still a bit noisier, only because, the Bros mid-drive is a belt drive, and it's just almost silent. You can hardly hear it at all. It's the best in the industry, so it's a pretty hard benchmark to compare against. But that being said, the X1 with the silent gear option is highly recommended, and it is a close second for the X1. But in this case, the edge for noise does go to Levo. So for the last comparison, the big one, the price tag. Now, it's kind of crazy when I've compared these two bikes and rode them so much. When I looked at the cost of these two bikes, as I'm seeing this review today, the X1 is on the website for $3,490, so $3,500 for the Carbon X1. This bike was $8,250 plus $75 for this display if you want the display. So you're talking over $8,300 for this bike. You could buy two X1s and have money left over to upgrade your shock and your wheels. It's pretty crazy when you compare the price of these bikes. It's an outstanding deal for the X1. The Levo is a great bike. It's a fantastic bike. It's just freaking expensive. But the X1 is really incredible for the price. And the clear edge, of course, in this comparison for price goes to the X1 by a mile. So looking at the scoring of these two bikes, it's pretty crazy. I did these categories one by one as I went down the list. I didn't look at the total until the very end, added them up, and I was like, man, it's pretty crazy to see where the points came out. Almost a dead tie when you look at each category. So it really depends on what's more important to you. And you can look at the list and see that, if power is more important to you and low cost is more important, it's pretty easy to say that the X1 is the right bike for you. Whereas if cost is not an option and peak power is not your primary concern and you want a natural feel and you want a more nimble ride, the Levo may be a better option for you. So it's really crazy to see how two bikes in the end can be so similar as far as individual scoring goes. But man, there is significant differences between them, which make them at the end of the day just a total toss-up, depending on what your personal preference is. So I can't say which bike's better. I can't say which bike you should go buy. Eric was nice enough to provide this Loner X1 to me to do these reviews and to test out, and I don't want to give it back, to be honest. It's been a fantastic bike. It's a bike that I do ride, as much as I ride the Levo. I'll jump on the X1 when I'm not as inclined to work as much as it requires on the Levo. The X1 is just great on the trails, which I have all around me. That's how I usually ride it. The Levo does have its place when I want to exercise and I want to feel like I'm really in tune with the bike and the trails. The Levo for me is a better bike for that. So really it just depends on the mood I'm in, and it's nice having the luxury of choosing. But for those of you that don't, you got to make a purchase. Boy, that price tag's pretty hard to argue against. You cannot go wrong with the X1, and of course the Levo is a fantastic bike. So after I did this head-to-head and had all the numbers laid out and the comparisons all done, I got more to thinking it was almost unfair to the X1 as far as the scoring went, because the components and the price of the X1 make it such a hard comparison. So what I did was I actually took a base model Levo and did a similar comparison of the components and the prices you get for the two bikes. And here's the results of that. So first, looking at components, you can see already the difference in the price from the Expert to the base model Levo is pretty significant, and the bike you get with a regular Levo isn't near as far as high quality components as you get on the Expert model. With those in consideration, I took those components and what that experience would be like, and also made scoring overall for the two bikes if you were to compare the X1 to a base model Levo. And you can see in this case the X1 clearly comes ahead at the end by a significant margin as far as points are concerned, and yet it's still less expensive than the Levo. So really, as a more accurate comparison to the base model, you can see the X1 would kill the Levo. And really the only reason we compared the Expert was because they're both carbon bikes. And what it shows you is just how much of a deal you get with the carbon X1, and the fact that we can compare this to the carbon Levo and have such a close result is pretty incredible. So that's kind of my summary of that. Hope this helps you guys out. Hope it helps you make a more informed decision. At the end of the day, they're both great bikes, of course, and all that matters is that you guys get out and ride no matter what you choose. So with that, get out and ride. Thanks.